Thanks very much. It's great to be here, and I'm glad to know I'm following two other people, and I just hope they got it right so that I can mess with the facts, because that's what historical fiction authors do. So Deborah's story was one that I knew from when I was really little. She's an ancestor of mine, and so my grandmother, Puffer, lived in Winchester, Massachusetts, and on Patriots Day every year we would drive, I grew up in rural Maine, and we would drive down to Winchester and we would go to see the reenactments of the battles of Lexington and Concord. And I had many ancestors who fought in the war, and my grandmother was a proud member of the DAR. And we would hear one set of ancestors' stories on the ride out to Concord, and then we would hear another set of stories on the ride back. And first place was Deborah Sampson. I loved hearing that story. And second place was the ancestors who fought with Benedict Arnold when he still was on the American side, and they pushed the bateau up the frozen river to the assault on Quebec. I thought that was pretty good too. But it hasn't made it into a novel yet. I think they all died, so that's not bad. Except for Benedict Arnold. Anyway, so writing this was really a joy. And I think the best, I got a lot of advice, good and bad, when I was starting to write this novel. And amongst the good advice was, think of writing a novel like a marriage. You were going to be spending a lot of time with this topic, and you better love it. And I do. I have a profound crush on Deborah Sampson. And I wrote this novel. It was published 4 years ago. At this point, I spent about 6 or 7 years intensely with her story. And I still read about her. I still look at information from the time period, and I find it utterly fascinating. So, and I'll leave plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to give a kind of overview of the research I did, where I fit the fiction in, what I found most interesting, and how I tried to get the fiction to be both truthful and a little bit, I would say, political or corrective of history, if I can say that. And then I'll happily take questions in whatever you want to look at and read that. So here is my ancestor in a 1790s portrait. And as I always say, if you see the family resemblance, just keep it to yourself. I love how she was described at the time when she, as I'll say later on, she went on a speaking tour. And during that tour, people would write up these newspaper articles of her. And they would often describe her as having a, quote, Roman nose, which is 19th century speak for a big schnoz. They also would comment routinely on what they call a heavy jaw. And she came from Anglia, East Anglia in England, and that a lantern jaw is actually a characteristic of that area of England. So she probably had a very heavy square jaw. She probably had a fairly large nose, and that might have helped her pass as a man. But this is our only surviving portrait of Deborah. So when I began my research, I was working with two sources to start with, one primary and one secondary. And the best primary source is in her As Told To memoirs, called The Female Review, and she wrote it in 1797 with a writer named Herman Mann. And I came to the realization that not only was the late 18th and early 19th century the worst era of American literature, but also that her memoir is probably more fictional than my novel. She felt it necessary to state a lot of things about her service that would make her appear virtuous and upstanding and feminine. That probably is wildly inaccurate if you want to believe that she passed and fought as well as she did. And she also wanted to tell her story in a way that would be sensational and would sell. And so she did things like put herself enlisting a year earlier so that she could be fighting in the last actual full-scale battle with artillery involved, the Battle of Yorktown. It is entirely possible, the Revolutionary War records are so poorly preserved, it's entirely possible that she enlisted in 1776. I mean, we just don't know. We have no record of when most people accurately enlisted. But in all likelihood, from the surrounding documentation, she didn't enlist until 1782. So she stretched the truth. The secondary source, was a wonderful monograph by a historian named Alfred Young, titled Masquerade. And it was invaluable. He did all this hard work just so that I wouldn't have to. He scoured the records, and he held things up and asked, in her memoir, okay, she writes about this, is it likely to be true or not true? And it was really helpful. And then when I sold the book, I was fortunate in being able to work with him as one of my historical editors, and I can talk more about that process if people are interested. So once I had my mind around when she had lived and what she had done, the next step of the research for me was the most interesting one, and that was to get out into the towns where she had lived and see what her life was like. So she was born in 1760 in the town of Plimpton, Massachusetts. That's not far from Plymouth, where the Pilgrims mythically got off the Mayflower. And she was one of 7 children. And when she was about 4 years old, her father abandoned the family. Her mother used to tell neighbors that it was quite a tragedy that her father had gotten on board a ship and the ship had been lost at sea. But the truth seems to be that, in fact, her father got on board a ship, sailed up the coast to Maine, and started another family. Deborah's mom had no way to support 7 children, and so she put out Deborah. That's the colonial term for foster care, and Deborah was given to a widow. And she served that widow from age 4 until probably about age 8, at which point the widow died. Deborah returned briefly to her mother's house, and her mother then sold her into indentured servitude, keeping the money from that sale, of course, for herself. Deborah always harbored this against her mother, which I can understand, particularly because she had 6 other siblings, many of whom were not sold into indentured servitude. So I don't know why Deborah's mom chose her, if she was particularly healthy, if she was particularly a fractious child. I don't know what the motivation was. But at any rate, she was sold to the Thomas family of Middleborough, Massachusetts. Mr. Thomas was a deacon in the Congregational Church. He had lots of kids. Deborah helped around the house. She helped with child rearing. She kept a flock of chickens and fowl. And at some point in time, she learned how to weave. And this was to be, and she also learned how to read. Probably the widow taught her how to read. It seems from what records we have that the widow was likely nearly blind, and taught Deborah to read so that she could be read to. But at some point in time, she was taught to weave, and this turned out to be probably the skill that was most pivotal in Deborah's life. Because in 1778, when she was 18 years old, she was freed of her indenture. And in 1778, a free woman was expected to do one of 3 things. You were expected to get married. You were expected to continue to serve in a house if you wished to be a servant, or you could go back and live with your father. You had to have a master. The colonial era was profoundly afraid of anybody who was quote-unquote masterless, even young men, but particularly concerned about masterless young women and what they might get up to. So Deborah did something quite profound at age 18. I think we're still concerned about masterless women even today. I say this as an so in 1778, she's 18, she's free of her indenture, and she says to her town, "No, thank you. I am not interested in marriage. I've had enough of service, and I don't have a father, so I will support myself." And the town, in a somewhat surprising move, because they really could have put the legal screws on her to sign on to serve, just said, "All right, fend for yourself. Don't come crying to me when you need food." And she was only able to support herself successfully because she could weave. And so here began my fun research. Back in the day, you would weave at a tavern. And she would often weave at Sproat Tavern. Now, you would weave at a tavern because looms were huge. They were the size of double beds. You had to be quite rich to afford a loom, and you had to be even more rich to afford a house to put the loom in. So taverns would own a couple of looms, and people could go and weave there and rent them. And people would be hired to weave somebody's harvest of flax or weave somebody's harvest of wool. And Deborah was the best linen weaver. So she would spend weeks and weeks and weeks at Sproat Tavern, which I was fascinated with as a fiction writer, reading and looking into tavern culture at the time. This was the political, social center of town, and it was generally all male space. Men would come in after a day of work. Men would come in from, if they lived in town or if they were coming in off the farm to sell something, and they'd head around at the tavern in the public room. And next door to the public room would be the space where the looms were kept. So this was where Deborah could have possibly overheard or gotten in touch with, or maybe even marginally participated in a public life that belonged almost exclusively to men. So in doing my research, I eagerly got in the car, dragging my lovely wife along with me to drive to Middleborough, Massachusetts to see Sproat Tavern, and all I found was this. It's the original 1750 outhouse. It's a really unique model. It's a 3-seater, and one of those seats is child size. And though this is a lovely building, I am hard-pressed to think of any more interesting historical society in New England than Middleborough, who has not only the Sproat Tavern outhouse and some Deborah Sampson memorabilia, but Middleborough's other famous inhabitant was Colonel Tom Thumb. Right? Okay, so what's that?
Maybe the seat was for him.
We need to measure. So they have preserved this lovely outhouse. It was actually a little disappointing to go and search for traces of Deborah in Middleborough today. One of the houses that she lived in is still there, with the original chimney in its original place, but everything else about it has shifted, including its location. And what I found was, the town has been so redone with roads, and even the rivers have been recoursed, that there's no way to see the colonial era at all. None of the town green remains or anything like that. So in 1778, Deborah's 18. She's living on her own. She's probably living mostly upstairs at Sproat Tavern and other area taverns. And she makes a second very profound move in 1780. She leaves the Congregational Church to join the Baptist Church, which was a fledgling congregation and really kind of radical. And she did it, she says, because the Baptists were egalitarian. They had non-hierarchical seating. She said she loathed that at the congregational meeting house you would walk in and the rich people had bought the pews up front, and the not so rich people had bought the pews up back, and the poor people sat in the first balcony, and the servants sat in the second, and the women servants sat in the third, and in the fourth, that's where people of color sat, regardless of their social status. She said she hated it, and she joined the Baptist congregation. And we have a record of her joining that. That's not in her own hand. We have no record of her signature in her own hand, but she's recorded as joining in 1780 when she was 20 years old. And there's something profound about thinking now how often we leave a trace of our name or a photograph or anything in the world, and how rare it was for a middle or lower class woman like Deborah to be recorded at all. Her birth is not recorded. We have no knowledge of that in any official document. So this is the first note of her existence, is when she's 20 years old. And it's funny because the next document has to do with her leaving the church. 1782 rolls around, and the Revolutionary War is almost over. And for the first time in the history of the war, when the call for recruits comes out in the spring, every town across Massachusetts is scratching to come up with soldiers to join. And across the state, they start to offer bounties. They're paying money for men to sign on. And Middleborough couldn't meet its muster numbers. So they're offering 20 pounds of silver by May of that year. And that would be more than Deborah would make in years of weaving. So she was probably sitting at her loom. She was probably listening to the tavern conversation next door, hearing some guy buying drinks for everybody to get them a little bit more interested in joining up, talking about the glory that awaited them, thinking, I could do with 20 pounds of silver myself. And that is exactly what she tried to do. She stole a set of men's clothes from a house where she was serving. She tucked her hair up under a cap, and she went down to a law office where they were enrolling recruits. She signed on under the name of Timothy Thayer and went home with her 20-pound silver, probably very proud of herself, only to have one of the muster officers knock on her door about a day later saying, we'll have that back, Miss Sampson. What had happened was, at some point in her weaving career, she had badly injured her finger on a piece of a loom called a felon, she injured her finger on a felon. When I first read that line, I was like, I don't know how that could happen. And then I had to learn about weaving machines. So anyway, she had a very bad scar up her index finger, and it prevented her from bending her finger. So when she held a quill, it was quite noticeable, and somebody in the law office, when she was signing on, saw that finger was unbent and said, that has to be Deborah Sampson. So she was threatened with arrest, made to return the money, and very quickly ran away from Middleborough. feeling that her reputation was ruined. And she was not wrong, because not long after she ran away, she was excommunicated from the Baptist church. And so this is the second time we see her name in writing. Notice that they spell it differently here. They spell it with a P, and in the first case they didn't. We still don't know how she preferred to spell her name, because these are the only two written instances we have of her maiden. So it says, consider the case of Deborah Sampson, a member of this church, who last spring was accused of dressing in men's clothes and enlisting as a soldier in the army. And although she was not convicted, because she ran away, yet was strongly suspected of being guilty, and this is the key line, and for some time before behaved very loose and unchristian-like. Yeah, I love that phrase. It says a world in just a few short words. Loose and unchristian-like. And you can read a lot into that. And this is where I began to take a real hold of who Deborah was within the eyes of her community. They believed she was loose. What other reason would a woman have for dressing like a man and going to hang out with soldiers? She was almost definitely read as a prostitute. And that's why she was trying to hang out with them. And on that basis alone, she was excommunicated. So the law in Middleborough, as it was across the state of Massachusetts and throughout the early American Republic, was that a woman couldn't wear men's clothing. And those laws lasted onto the books well into the 20th century, and in some cases into the 21st century. But that was not so much the law that she was pursued or convicted under. What concerned Deborah much more was her reputation. And she really felt that if she stayed in Middleborough, her life was over. No one would hire her, and she no longer had this church and other sort of social access that she would want as a member. So she ran away. She left the town, and she began to wander around Massachusetts. So this is a 1780s map of Massachusetts, and I use it to illustrate the fact that it was incredibly difficult to find out where any roads were at the time. AAA did a really poor job at publishing these maps. I tried to figure out where she would walk to get from point A or point B, and it's just all the tracks are unrecorded. It's like, cows wandered and probably people followed them, and that's what they did. But anyway, so I drew straight lines because I couldn't possibly figure out how she got from point A to point B. She starts here in Middleborough. She goes down to New Bedford. She thought she would sign on as a sailor. She had probably read a chapbook that was circulating and very popular in the early American Republic. It was the story of Hannah Snell. And it was the story of a woman who signed on dressed as a man in the British Navy in 1760. And it's a true story, and Hannah Snell served for about 6 months as a Marine before disembarking and saying enough of that. And I think Deborah was inspired by that, probably looked at signing on, decided against it, wisely in my opinion, went all the way up to Boston. She's a little bit cagey about what she did in Boston. She probably tried to find a job as a weaver, but she's not really explicit. We know she did consult with some sort of medium to get her dreams interpreted. She was a big interpreter of dreams, and that's mostly what she tells us about her voyage to Boston. Fascinating. And then a little bit despondent, she begins to wander around the countryside and from town to town here, asking, do you still need troops, and how much are you paying? She lands in Bellingham and Uxbridge. They're paying £60 sterling for men. She signs on under the name of Robert Shirtliff, and promptly is told, great, we will see you up in Worcester. So that is the purple line here. She walks up to Worcester. About 150 miles of walking around by the time she signed on, and then they marched her all the way to West Point. We don't have her signature on the muster rolls. We have a copy of the enlistment papers, and it's probably 2 or 3 times distant copy, but there Robert Shirtliff appears. Why she picked that name? 2 very common names. It's not a family name. There's no reason she would have picked that name in particular. So she's pretty explicit about what happens to her next, and what she says lines up with what's accurate historically. So she says, we got to West Point, and immediately they put us through a series of exercises, running and jumping and crawling and all of these things to determine who would go where. And she proudly states, I was picked for my regiment's company of Light Infantry. These are the crack troops of the Revolutionary War, the best of the best. And here's this is not a picture of Deborah, it's just the uniform that she wore. And people often ask me, how is it that a 22-year-old woman would be picked for the Light Infantry? And so here it was important for me to understand this myself, to explain a little bit about recruitment at the time. So when you joined the Light Infantry, there were 2 very strict requirements in the spring of 1782. Well, 3. You had to be a man, but they didn't check that, so no longer. You had to be tall, and you had to have teeth. So I can see this musket on this gentleman here. You had to be able to draw your ramrod and shove it down to load the gun. So you had to be pretty tall. Deborah was 5'7". That was very tall for a woman and pretty tall for a man at the time. And you had to have teeth because you would pull out your shot and you would rip it open. If you didn't have teeth, you couldn't load your weapon because it was packed in paper or parchment. Depending on how picky the muster masters were being on that given day, you had to have either 3 or 5 teeth. I didn't know how many Deborah did. I guess that spring it was 3 teeth because I'll read you a quote from George Washington. He wrote about the spring class of recruits in 1782 at West Point, the class that Deborah came in with. And he wrote this in a court-martial of one of the recruiting officers from Massachusetts. He said, "I am court-martialing you for having brought in your recruits as follows: 4 deserters, 2 from the British Army and 2 from the French, 4 boys, undersized, 2 immigrants who promptly decamped, a Negro, lame in the ankle, and George West, an idiot." So those were Deborah's competition. So I hope I am not disparaging my ancestor by putting her in such a context, and it really helped me understand what she was up against in terms of why no one was questioning her and why she was picked to be in the Light Infantry. It also helps to know that this uniform, they were issued 1 of them. And she tells us that in a year and a half of service in the Army, she was forced to bathe on 2 or 3 occasions. So nudity was not part of this culture. Yes, they lived in very close quarters. Yes, they lived in little tents. Yes, they slept in the rough. But at no point were you changing out of your uniform to put on your Army-issued pajamas or something. It wasn't happening. So they were more or less encased in these like a sausage and skin. Okay, so Deborah is enlisted. Service at that time was really quite spotty and marginal, and this is where I got to have a lot of fun as a fiction writer. We have 1 good diary of a lieutenant and a couple of letters from a lieutenant at the time that records the action of the era. She was in the Hudson Valley Theater of War. There were a lot of camps. It's a little bit hard to see, but you get the forts that are up here were used only in the early part of the war. There was a big boom chain across the Hudson. I got excited. I toured West Point and looked at that and thought, ooh, I'm going to have fun writing about this. No, the British are down here in Manhattan, and there's nothing going on. They're sitting down there, and Deborah's sitting up in West Point, and let's ho hum. What they would do is in the summer and fall, they would patrol all up and down Hudson Valley, stopping at camps like Sing Sing and Tarrytown, and basically what they were trying to do is make life miserable for the loyalist farmers. So the British occupied Manhattan, and if you were a loyalist and you owned an estate or a farm up in the Hudson Valley in Westchester, you probably sent yourself or one of your elder sons out to protect it for the duration of the war, and to do that you would hire your own small army. So it was mostly skirmishes with what were called irregulars, and today we call them mercenary forces. So the U.S. Army would come and harass them, try to take the crops, try to get the loyalists to leave so that they could claim that land for themselves. It was profoundly not the sort of service that Deborah wanted to talk about. It was not the glamorous patriotic stuff. But she did see action, and this is backed up by regimental log books, which basically say, today we rotated down to Sing Sing, today we were in Tarrytown. It's very, very boring. And it was great for me as a fiction writer. It left lots of holes that I could fill. And the most exciting part comes when she says, I was injured in battle, and indeed, again, logbooks back this up. She was injured in battle. She had a fragment embedded in her thigh. She performed surgery on herself on the battlefield to escape detection, and then didn't want to tell people that she had done so, and so was limping around, making up excuses for why she was limping. And her regimental officer, her company officer, finally said, "If you can't walk, you're not coming back to camp with us. I'm leaving you with this guy who was also pretty injured, and I'm going to quarter you in a farmer's house." So she was given to a farmer named, with the excellent name of Van Tassel. And he said, "I'll put you up in my attic, in my garret, and you can stay there until you're healthy enough to go march back to West Point." And in her notebook, she basically says, in her memoir, she basically says, "I was there for a couple of months." That you're alone in the attic with another soldier for a couple of months. Anything can happen. So I promptly broke the other soldier's legs and had a good time. This is actually the only moment when Deborah says that somebody had come close to discovering her true sex. When she was nursing this other soldier back to health, at some point he said to her, so she tells us, why Bob Shirtliff, you must be a woman. No man would ever nurse me so well. And I like that line very much. Sadly, he died before he returned, so she couldn't have done that. But that was a lot of fun fictionally to kind of play with. And there were just lots and lots of gaps in her story that I found could be filled. So anyway, she comes back to health, and by the time she returns to her company, they have left West Point for the final winter of the Revolutionary War and gone to New Windsor. So at New Windsor, Washington has his headquarters in Newburgh, which is nearby. It's still quite a beautiful spot. Washington had the troops fell all the trees and build these huts. Originally, they would have had a stone chimney on both ends. And I live in a boys' dorm now with 58 charming teenagers, and whenever I look at this picture, it makes me feel better about that reality. Deborah shared this hut with 16 men for 4 months of winter, with snowbanks probably 3 to 4 feet high. This is where fiction was not going to be able to accommodate fact. I walked around this cabin, and they have little models of them. That they were triple-decker bunks, one chamber pod, and I thought to myself, there is no way, there's just no way I can write this in such a manner that people are going to believe that nobody discovered her. So in the novel, I give her private quarters. She did serve a general, and general servants did have private quarters, so that was an accurate reflection. She says she stayed in this cabin. I have no reason to doubt her, but I cannot fathom how she survived. So not long after the winter was over, they did return to West Point. The war was really winding down. At this point, the soldiers are mostly occupied with putting down mutinies. So she goes to Philadelphia to put down a mutiny of the Pennsylvania line, and that is where she is ultimately discovered, not through any glamorous or dramatic scene. She had a fever, she lost consciousness, she was taken to a military hospital, and a doctor there by the wonderful name Barnabas Binney opened up her jacket to treat her and discovered that she was a woman. And this was one of the most profound moments. I had heard this story in very brief form from my grandmother and never really knew how it all ended. And I just imagined it ended very badly. But Barnabas Binney took her back to his house, nursed her back to health, and then gave her an offer and said, I will restore to you your uniform, if that's what you want, or give you a dress, if that's what you want. And she said, uniform, please. And he gave it back to her. And he said, I will just give you the advice that you should probably tell your commanding officers. They would be impressed and awestruck that a woman had served, and they've come asking for you. I haven't said anything. And when they speak of you, they say you're a wonderful soldier. So I think you should tell them. And she did. And she did not have any negative repercussions. She was given an honorable discharge. She was allowed to remain in uniform. And we have very few records of other women who served in this time, but the records we have, these women were arrested, fined, were what was called drummed out, made to walk down a gauntlet as people were rolling the drums. It was a walk of shame, and they were done so, and they were basically treated as prostitutes. That's how women were read. So the fact that she was given an honorable discharge, to me, indicated that her service must have been exceptional and her character exceptional as well. So that was, again, something that really helped me shape her. So after the war, she kind of gives us radio silence. After the war, we don't get any information. We have some passed down stories from neighbors who say that when she came back from the war, she tried to live as a man. She told people that she was her brother, Ephraim. The only problem was that the real Ephraim Sampson was living 2 towns over. And eventually they put 2 and 2 together, and the jig was up. And she eventually took on her life as Deborah, married, and had 3 children. We have her recorded, her marriage again recorded as Deborah Sampson Gannett, and settled down, quiet life as a farmer's wife, until she got it in her mind to apply for a petition, first to the state of Massachusetts and then to the U.S. Congress. And this is where her life gets interesting again. Totally unsuccessful, everything rebuffed, even though she got her generals and captains to write letters on her behalf saying, yeah, she served in disguise, yes, she was an exceptional soldier, yes, she was wounded, I'm vouching for her. It was not until she got Paul Revere to write on her behalf that she was successful in her petition. So he wrote a long letter with a lovely signature at the end, and I've just extracted a few bits from that. So I'll read it to you in case the font is too small. It's worth considering. I have induced to inquire, I kept all the spelling originals, so don't get on me about typing. Her situation and character since she quitted the male habit and soldier's uniform for the more decent apparel of her own sex, and since she has been married and become a mother. Humanity and justice obliges me to say that every person with whom I have conversed about her, and it is not abused, speak of her as a woman of handsome talents, good morals, a dutiful wife, and an affectionate parent. So he's writing to a board that's going to decide should she get her pension or not. And again, I, as a reader and as a writer, I like to push against the grain and saying, why is he saying this? And what's the need to defend her femininity? What's the need to defend her character? And you get more of it here. When I heard her spoken of as a soldier, I formed the idea of a tall, masculine female who had a small share of understanding without education and one of the meanest of her sex. When I saw and discoursed with, I was agreeably surprised to find a small, feminine, and conversible woman whose education entitles her to a better situation in life. So in other words, she's worthy of a pension because she has A, become a dutiful wife and mother, and B, is not the kind of scary Amazon that you might think she is. Given how her neighbors described her, I don't think this is an accurate depiction. She taught what was called summer school, which was really for the very, very little children who weren't useful in the fields. And one of her pupils remembers quite literally being hanged from the thumbs by Deborah. So I think that's a little more in keeping. Anyway, but he wrote this lovely letter, and she got her pension from the state of Massachusetts and from the U.S. Congress. She's the first American female military veteran to get a pension. She is not the first American woman to get a military pension. That honor goes to Margaret Corbin, one of the Molly pitchers, who was actually garrisoned at West Point until she died. She never served in the military. Technically, she was a camp, what they call a camp follower, but she was injured in battle and so got a military pension. The hook I like about Deborah's pension is Deborah predeceases her husband. And so her husband becomes the first man to draw a military pension through his wife's service. So, armed with this pension, Deborah thought that she could kind of make it for the rest of her life, but the pension was very, very small, and her husband was a profoundly bad farmer. And so she wrote this as told to memoir, and then went on the road on a public lecture tour. She becomes America's first traveling woman lecturer. And she went, she starts in Sharon, that's where she settled with her husband, and she went throughout Massachusetts. She goes down to Providence and Newport, and she goes out to upstate New York. And the reason she picks this path, and the reason that towns like Holden and Boston, which are somewhat random towns, are on there is because that's where her general and captains whom she served in the war had settled. One of them was a huge landowner in this area, General Patterson, and he was actually a congressman at the time as well. And so she went out and she stayed with him for quite a time. In fact, he had to kind of kick her out. She grew quite comfortable in his house. It was, I would think, wildly successful would be a stretch, but it got a few positive reviews, and she drew pretty big audiences, and she made some money on her lecture tour. She made some money on her book as well. This is the frontispiece of the book, the same portrait as I began with, and it's written, as I said, by this ghostwriter, Herman Mann. And again, it's just worth considering this as a primary source about her life, a person who spent a lot of time interviewing her, and this is how he sets it up. This is from the preface. So the full title is The Female Review, or Memoirs of an American Young Lady whose life and character are peculiarly distinguished, being a Continental soldier for nearly 3 years in late American war. Phew. I think he was paid by the war. So this is from the preface. Suspicious from my first engagement that the female review would be a subject as delicate, especially for the ladies, as it is different from their pursuits. I have studiously endeavored to ameliorate every circumstance that might seem too much tinctured with the rougher masculine virtues. This, however, has not been attempted with the duplicity of a facetious courtier, but with a diction softened and comported to the taste of a virtuous female. Yeah, so it just gets better, folks. Don't spend your money on this, buy my novel instead. But again, just kind of reading against that, who is this author? What is he doing with this story, and why is he doing it? This is going to be the story of a virtuous, feminine woman who upheld worthy ideals like patriotism. This is not going to be a story of that masculine, dangerous, sphere-busting woman who goes out of her proper realm. That's what she was very afraid of being painted in such a way. So again, a lot of the primary sources I felt as a fiction writer, what I was doing was perhaps correcting the record, if I can make so bold a claim. I felt that she had been miswritten and misrepresented in order to fit her to the delicacies of the time. So it was a very useful document in that sense. But I did feel that in my fictional position I could write against that. So, and her lecture tour is worth commenting on. So we have a record of her speech. It's really bad. And she would get up in her dress and she would give it all about how virtuous she was as a woman and how reluctant she was to take up arms, but she did so in the service of her country. And then she'd go backstage, put on her old uniform, and get out there with a musket and go through the manual exercise of arms, which I think somewhat undercuts her claim to being reluctant to take up arms. But anyway, she did so, and this was what delighted audiences, that this middle-aged woman would get up there with a musket and march around. It was America's first drag show. Yeah, so this is this story that I tell in Revolutionary. I could go endlessly into depth about things that were peculiar and fun, or peculiar and not fun to research, but I will happily just take questions because there's a lot of different areas and I want to talk about what you're curious about. Sure.
You discussed her pre-revolutionary life. Did that come out of her book, or where, the learning to weave, and where did all that information come from?
Yes, there's a very brief synopsis in her book, but a lot of it I had to flesh out through research of other people. The lives of low and middle income Americans, or probably any people, are not well recorded. It's quite difficult to find out what they ate, what they wore, how they acquired what they wore when they couldn't make it themselves. So that was some of the most difficult research to do, and had to rely a lot on circumstantial information. Sure.
Having spent a lot of time thinking about Deborah and her era, do you think that you've been successful enough to step out of the current era to think about her actual motivations?
Yes. So in writing fiction, I really think the basis of good fiction is good character, and the basis of good character is desire. What does the character want? And until you as an author can understand that truth about your character, you're never going to have a good story, because it's desire that's going to pull that character to do or not do certain things. So that was actually one of the first questions I had to answer, and I had to be honest about it. I think in some way Deborah wanted money. I think she, as an indentured servant, could see how the upper class lived and resented the fact that she had no access to that. And I think she also wanted mobility and freedom in that way. and she chafed at being unable to get away. She was tied to Middleborough. Women couldn't travel without a chaperone. There was no man in her life who was going to take her somewhere else. And so she was profoundly stuck. And I think those are her two main drives. That's what she really wanted. Sure.
In the book, you have her having this relationship with Jenny.
Mm-hmm.
And where did that character come from?
Yeah, so in the book I have this character named Jenny, who's a house servant along with Deborah. So there is a historical Jenny, and Jenny served a nearby family in Middleborough, and it seemed that family had a loom, and Deborah wove for them sometimes. She says that she often shared a bed with a servant, which is not an uncommon practice. Everybody shared a bed. So they were friends. In real life, Jenny was a free African-American individual living in Middleborough, and I wanted Deborah in the book, to have a correspondence home, but we know that Jenny, the real Jenny, was illiterate, and she was probably illiterate because she was African-American. It would have been harder to orchestrate a character who could write who was also black. So I made her a white character in the novel. Yeah.
After the war, you said she went home, I think?
Yes.
Was that to Deborah?
Yes.
And then she got married. So was that a gap that you filled in quite a bit with, or did you find out more about that?
So the novel more or less ends with her returning home, and then there's a gap, and we pick up just for her speaking to her. In real life, she doesn't write robustly or leave many notes about this time period. So she was marched home, like every other soldier in the Revolutionary War. At the end, when they were de-garrisoning West Point, they were really afraid that people were going to mutiny, because they weren't being paid, and there was no promise of them being paid. And so the instructions were given: march them right back to their mother's house and say to them, "Mom, do not let your kid rebel." That's it. And so Deborah, for obvious reasons, begged not to be taken back to her mother's house, and instead was taken back to an aunt's house who lived in nearby Stoughton, in Sharon, Massachusetts. And she ends up there. Again, she says she's a Frian. That lasts about 6 months. And at that point, she says she began to entertain some of the young men of the neighborhood and get to know them. And that was going to be the expectation, was basically sign on as a servant or get married. She was right back to where she had been in 1778. So she kind of shops around. Benjamin Gannett looks like a likely suspect. He's the eldest son. He's going to inherit this farm. It didn't work out the way she planned. And they got married, and lo and behold, she had what was called at the time an early baby. Now, I love this. I love that they have a term for it and that it's recorded, and obviously a fairly common practice that you have a term for it. So, so much for what I have been told about my illustrious ancestors. But yes, so she had an early baby, and then she had 2 more after that, which was very few by early American standards, and the rumor around town is that she cut her husband off. We don't know that for sure. Yeah.
Did she keep in touch with any of her family, her brothers, sisters?
No, she was not close to her family. As an adult, she lived nearby some of her siblings and visited with them. She lifelong had a profoundly bad relationship with her mother, who would still come around when Deborah was an adult and ask for money. Yes, some hubris there. But her I guess her relationships with her siblings were cordial but not close. I mean, she didn't grow up with them. She probably barely knew some of them who were babies when she left. Yep.
Any information about her church membership after the war?
Interesting. When she married, she rejoined the Congregationalist Church. And in part that may be because that was Benjamin's affiliation, but in part I think it was also a social status thing, where, again, just as when she'd served, she'd seen how the other half lived. When she was in the army, she served General Patterson as what was called at the time a waiter. Today we call it an aide. But as a waiter, she helped him get dressed in the mornings, and she brought him food at table, in addition to laying out maps and doing that sort of thing, carrying messages for him. So she very much saw how he lived. the generals lived quite nicely. They ate off fancy china, and she envied that tremendously. And I think she saw the Congregationalist Church as a way to gain some entry into that society.
The bad background with the Baptist Church never came back.
And her reputation was ruined, and in some ways, some letters that survived from contemporaries in Middleborough, and they largely thought in town that she had run away to be with some young man, that she had eloped, in essence. And then somebody serving in another Massachusetts regiment reported seeing someone who looked a lot like Deborah Sampson serving in the Army, and so that rumor spread around Middleborough, so they heard about it before she came back. I think it's fair to say, from what we have passed down, that people really regarded her quite well. They called her the old soldier. She would go out and farm in her old blue regimental jacket, and kids would come by and ask her to tell stories about her service. So again, I think this is a testament to her remarkable personality, that people didn't hold it against her or resent her for it, but she was rather celebrated. Peculiar, to be sure, but celebrated. Yeah.
I'm curious about the graphic on your cover.
Me too.
Yes.
So I was told as a first-time author that I was allowed, by my agent, that I was allowed to have one major hissy fit and 2 minor hissy fits. And that was it. And she said, save the major hissy fit for the cover. So they asked me what were the themes of Revolutionary, and I told them the themes, and they got most of them. So I talked about patriotism and the American identity. I talked about division and unity, and so I think they got some of that across. But then they put this picture, which is totally anachronistic. She's a French soldier, and the pistol that she's holding was not extant U. Didn't have pieces like that in the 1780s. Deborah would never have been issued a sidearm as a private, and the hat was just ridiculous. And she's wearing a skirt. Now, I grant you that when you close the book, it is kind of clever. It almost looks like she's got pants on, and then when you open it up, it's only to see that it's a skirt. But I was like, it's not worth it. I want to save my major hissy fit for something else. But I never got to spend it, so I sometimes think I'll call up my editor and just give her a piece of my mind. Anyway.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Alex, I'm curious about the research, where you had to go for a lot of these books, documents, and did you ever run into like a brick wall that just stymied you for a long time and then finally it opened up?
The Massachusetts Historical Society has a lot. A lot of things are actually digitized and online, and I don't have to dig through anything. And there were things that I wanted to see that I couldn't see. She did leave a brief journal that I was able to read a duplicate of, but not see in her own hands. And I would want to see that. I think her family, her closer descendants than I, have that. I think there were aha moments when I had been wondering about something and read, would go back to the journals and letters that we have from soldiers at that time and be like, oh, and get that understanding that I was looking for from someone else's words. The most satisfying moment of research, I got into a really bad fight with a historical copy editor, as one does, over the question of whether soldiers in the Revolutionary War were issued underwear or not. They were not issued. No one wore underwear unless you were really rich. But it took a lot of calls to strange people for me to win that battle. It was profoundly satisfying to be proven right. It was actually somebody at Colonial Williamsburg who helped to them. And I think the other strangest thing that materialized, was I was giving a talk at the Portland, Maine Public Library, and afterwards this woman had been kind of lurking around to ask a question, and you know if they've been lurking that they really have a good question to ask. So she says, I have something to show you. It's in my car. She had brought with her what she claimed was Deborah Sampson's musket. Now, I have no way of knowing if it was, but it was a musket, and she had transported it in her car. And I said, where do you normally keep this? And she said, under my couch. Yeah, I didn't know. I said, that's wonderful. That was great. Somebody has a musket they think is Deborah Sampson. Sure.
When is the film coming out? Who would you cast as Deborah?
Okay, so so some crazy guy has written the screenplay, but I have not heard from him in over a year, so I should check in with what's going on with that. He wanted, so I don't watch movies, so I'm not really good at this game. He wanted help, Jennifer. Who played Katniss Everdeen? And I wanted the woman who in Game of Thrones plays Brunhilde. I always forget her name. Brienne. Who's 6'3". Well, she looks smaller on camera. I don't know. I think a good soldier. I think of Deborah Sampson. Have any of you, if you've seen the film adaptation of Orlando, where Tilda Swinton?
Yes.
That era of Tilda Swinton is who I would like to be cast as Deborah Sampson, because I think Tilda Swinton has. She does not look particularly masculine, and yet she plays a man very convincingly. So first I need to invent a time machine and kidnap Tilda Swinton from the past to play Deborah Sampson in the future. And once that happens, the movie will be coming out.
Got it.
Have you met any other descendants as a result of this?
Yes, there are tons of us. There are a lot of Deborah Sampson descendants. And, I love speaking to the DAR for many reasons. They have good cookies. The first question they ask is, now precisely how are you descended? So I learned to bring my family tree with me. And I am descended, as they say, over and down. I'm descended from her brother, Ephraim. And I was told early on, that's acceptable to be descended over and down, but you can't go up and then down. By which they mean you can't trace back to a common ancestor. So for instance, both Deborah and I are descended from William Bradford, one of the early governors. But we're not descended through the same rep, right? So I could not say I'm related to Deborah Sampson because we're related to Deborah Bradford. So people will claim that, I mean, come on, how many people came on the Mayflower? Not that many. But I have met a number of her. And some of her stuff is still in the family. Table, it's a combo table bench, you can like flip the top, and a dress, and a record book, and a couple of other things are still.
And when did she die?
1820-ish. Yeah, she lived to her late 50s or early 60s. She might maybe early 1820s.
So what are you working on next? Or now?
Well, this break was a good time. I started a new project that should keep me occupied for a while, because I just finished up a manuscript of a new novel. This was not historical enough, so I went back to a 13th century French poem called Silence, which tells the story of a knight named Silence, there's a king who makes a law that no women can inherit his kingdom. So the Count Cador has a daughter and is profoundly alarmed by this law because it means that he's going to lose all his land. So he raises his daughter as a son, Silence. He becomes a great leader and goes out and has many conquests, and then realizes, oh crap, what do I do with my life now? Because I can't get married. It has this massive identity crisis, and it involves murder as well. So I'm sure this will have the same fate as my screenplay, and I will go on to write it.